which is always a problem. So, okay, thank you for the introduction, as I say, and thank you for having me. So what's the idea behind this presentation of that I'm going to do today is to give you a little bit of an overview on this new trend and new perspective on analyzing drought events as an events-based approach, so that take into account the spatial and temporal characteristic of drought together at the same time. So what I'm going to do in this presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of a quick introduction on this modeling approach, this novel modeling approach, for the one of you that are not familiar with it. And then I'm going to show you some application and some idea with the attempt to give you some suggestion on new things that can be done, maybe inspiration also for new kind of way to look at the drought phenomena in your study, in your analysis. Actually, I'm really happy to follow the presentation from Adriana because she showed the SOS, which is a really nice and really useful tool that give us information on drought monitoring and forecasting. With what let me pass the word like in a classical approach. So what we usually do, and this is exactly what we saw in the previous presentation, is we analyze drought either as in the temporal evolution. So we look at time series of river discharge for a specific location. Okay, so we fix the region and we look at the time series. Or we look at spatial distribution. So we define at certain temporal windows, like today or the last months or the next months, and we look at the spatial distribution of the drought condition. But this is not exactly how we as humans perceive the drought events. This is not how drought evolves in general in the real world, because drought are spatial temporal phenomena. So when we look at the drought events, it evolves in space and time at the same time. No? So we are used to disentangle these two information and look at the two aspects separately, but actually they occur at the same time. So the rationale between the introduction of this method is try to develop some kind of tools that is able to give information about how the events evolve both in space and time. This is not a completely novel idea, of course. I didn't come up with this idea. Already there was in the early 2000s some very pioneer work from Andreadis that was trying to approach drought from this perspective. So he introduced his method, which was mostly based on contiguous drought area. So the idea was to look at a series of pixels under certain drought condition, and then try to see if those pixels are connected, so they're close to each other, if they create some kind of cluster. Okay? So this method introduced this kind of concept, but of course was a very, very rigid approach. They didn't have much flexibility, they didn't have much parameter that allow for adjusting the result from this method. So when we started to look into this topic, we realized that we needed something more flexible. So this is why we come up with a new method, which was based on the concept of clustering, in particular on the concept of 3D weighted clustering based on what is called DBSCAN. DBSCAN is a really common from the shelf, let's say, to do clustering of data. So why we introduced these things? First, because we want a very flexible approach to adapt to different conditions. We know that drought is characterized by a very varied range of conditions, depending on which variable we are focusing on, which kind of application we are aiming. Are we looking at multi-annual drought events from a more climatological perspective, or we are looking at really short burst events, what are called flash drought, that are interesting only as a short season? Okay, so in order to have a tool that is able to reproduce the spatial temporal dynamics of all these different kind of drought, we wanted to introduce something that is very flexible. So we introduced this method that basically look at so what are the main characteristics? It's look at the density of drought points in space and time, so in 3 dimensions, and instead of using very rigid threshold to define a 0-1 drought, non-drought condition, use a continuous definition of drought with different levels of severity, which acts like the weighting factor for attracting or rejecting point in the surround. Okay. So as I was saying, why we need this kind of flexible approach? Because different users perceive drought in different ways. Okay. So if we talk with climatologists, they tend to associate drought to big drivers like El Nino, or very big teleconnection phenomena. And these phenomena are usually affecting drought with long-lasting, sometimes even multi-annual events. while some other users can be interested on the impact on agricultural production, which usually starts at the early of the growing season and then ends when the yield occurs, okay? And at the same time, we will know very well that drought is characterized using a very large array of drought indicators, going from meteorological drought to agricultural drought to hydrological variable like stream flow, groundwater. And each one of these variables has different spatial temporal characteristics, and we want different tools to catch this dynamic. Of course, having a very flexible tool also means that we need something that, we need to tune this model and calibrate the parameter to reproduce something that it's in line with what we expect. And for instance, here there is an example of application for agricultural drought over Europe, where we use expert-based mapping of a series of past drought events, about 40 drought events, as a reference to tune the algorithm. And in this way, we detected about 200 events of agricultural drought events over Europe in the period 81-2020. Here you see a mapping of 18 of the largest drought events detected with this method. So this is the methodology. So how we extract events starting from spatial temporal information. Now, of course, if you just look at that, we don't see really any added value, let's say, of doing this compared to what we do classically with other modeling approach. But the real advantage of using this kind of methodology in analyzing drought is that it gives us a new perspective on what drought it is. So it gives us information that are not usually easy to extract from single point or single time frame maps. Information like what is the place of origins of a certain event, what is the main direction of expansion and contraction of those events, how these events develop both in space and time in terms of velocity. So when we talk about flash drought, we can start to look at the concept of flashiness also in terms of how quickly they expand in space. No? Spatial temporal displacement, cascading effect, not only cascading in time, but also cascading in space, etc., etc. So the idea of looking at drought from this perspective is to give us all this new way that we can look at the drought. So now I'm going to show you a couple of examples of applications that we have been doing, again, with the idea to inspire you a little bit on looking at drought in a different way than how I've been looking at drought in the past. Okay? So here, for instance, there is an example of how we studied the 30 major droughts in Europe from a spatial temporal perspective. For instance, on the left, you can see how we can take all these events and we can look how I lost the show. So how the temporal evolution occur also in space in terms of how the area change in the progression in time of the event. So we can build this kind of function, and we can see that not all the events evolve in the same time, in the same way. Some events start very slowly in the expansion, and then they start to ramp up quickly later on, and some other behave exactly on the opposite. So they expand very quickly at the beginning, and then they consolidate and they stay the same for a long time. We can also look at how the area of a drought events change in time and in which direction the expansion occurs more often. So you can see here how for a specific events, we have two different time steps. So we can see how the drought was interesting in this area in the first step, and then was interesting in this second area at the second step. And by dividing the space in different quadrants, we can see in which direction it's expanding more rapidly. And from this data, we can build plot like this, can give us information for different phases of the drought, early part, central part, or end of the drought. What are the prevalent direction of expansion? For instance, for those 30 major droughts in Europe, we can see how there are some common features, like a predominance of expansion in the east-west direction. You can see all these plots are, mostly of these plots are elongated along this direction. And we can also classify drought based on those characteristics. And we observed, for instance, how summer and winter drought have very, very different characteristics in terms of how they evolve spatially and temporally. Okay. We expanded this analysis also worldwide. This is a research that we did very recently, it's still under review. And you can see how this predominance of west-east development is not common just for Europe. It's very common in all the Northern Hemisphere, Northern US, Asia, while on the southern hemisphere, there is a little bit more variety in the direction. This is probably also due to the simple configuration of our Earth, of the landscape of our Earth. We can analyze also a little bit, again, from a different perspective, the concept of cascading effect, which is very well known on the temporal timeline, but is not really that often investigated in the spatial temporal characteristic. For instance, we can see how here, if we look at different indicator, how the predominance of one indicator in a certain phase of the events change depending on which indicator we are focusing on. So if we look at very short time SPI data, for instance, is predominant at the beginning of the events, and then they start to disappear towards the ends. While if we look at soil moisture anomalies, the opposite occurs. So normal soil moisture conditions are available at the beginning when the precipitation is anomalous, and then we start to have a predominance of soil moisture anomalies at the end of the drought. And we can see here this also from a spatial temporal perspective again, of course. So you can see how if we plot the contribution of each variable with a different color, we can see how in the early stage, there is a predominance of red, which means precipitation indicator. And when we move later on close to the peak, we start to see a predominance of combination of precipitation and soil moisture, and then later on soil moisture on. Okay, again, a little bit of a different way to look at drought compared to what we are used to. One last application that I want to show you, I think I'm already running out of time very quickly. It's how this tool can be used also to do seasonal forecast analysis. Okay, so basically, instead of looking at the forecast again of a single pixel, we look at how we forecast an ensemble of events, so a cluster of events. And then we can look at how this cluster are consistent amongst different members of the ensemble. Okay, this is a work that we did within a Horizon project that we have with the CNR actually, which is called CDFD, where we're looking at different ways to look at seasonal forecast for drought. So how a forecast based on clustering look like? It look like something like that. So we see that the color scheme basically represents how many ensemble members provide a clustering for that region in the next coming 6 months. So it means that the darker is the shades, the more it's likely that this part of the world will be included in a cluster of drought. And what you see as a hatched area, it's the reanalysis product that we use as a reference. You can clearly see how, for instance, many past drought events very well known, like the drought in Europe of 2003, or South American drought in the Amazon in 1997, or the Eastern US drought in 2012, etc., is quite well captured by this approach, not only in terms of the spatial dynamics and temporal dynamics, but also in terms of consistency of the ensemble. Okay. Of course, some limitation on this forecasting tool still remains related to the quality of the forecasting itself. So this methods works very well for short lead time, and they start to degrade as the farther we go in terms of lead time from the day we generate the forecast. But still, we can see how there is a positive and robust scale even 6 months after the generation of a forecast. So to conclude, the idea of this presentation is to introduce what it's called an event-based approach that allows to study jointly the spatial and temporal dynamic of drought. So not studying these two characteristics separately anymore, but to study it together in a single modeling approach. We see how this model is designed to be very flexible, and we show a couple of examples how this kind of tool can provide a new perspective on drought and hopefully inspire a new way to look at the drought events phenomena in the future. And that's it from my side. Thank you. I'm open to answer any question, of course, if there is any.
Thank you very much, Carmelo. I was not introducing you too much because of all the content that I was sure that you were going to explain. It was amazing, at least from the point of view of the geeks that we are in these things. But all of you, all of our participants, whenever you have a question, we will have time now and also later on in the discussion. Please just be free to ask whatever you want to Carmelo, that as you have seen is a mastermind in these things.
Hi, yeah, I had a question on the. My name is Nicholas. I work more on the Shrinkswell with insurance companies with INSAR, and so the different circle with the different colors that you mix together to see the evolution of the drought. And I was wondering if you could explain it because you went quite fast, and it was quite interesting to see the evolution. I really liked this kind of visualization of different factors and impact factors. I think you
Carmelo,
mute.
yeah. Carmelo, the microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry for the microphone. So this is the figure that you were referring to, right? So let me put it up full screen to help a little bit. So what is the idea? The idea that when we study drought from a two-dimensional perspective, of course, within our two-dimensional events, the different drought indicator can assume different value and different condition. Okay, so sometimes even if we define this as a drought event, it can happen that in an early stage, for instance, of the drought, soil moisture conditions are still in near normal or even wetter than normal. Okay, so what we show here, it's like an overlap of the contribution of each one of the indicator with a different color. So if we see purple, it means that SPI is very extremely dry, SPI 3.
Okay.
If it's yellow, means that SPI 1 is very extreme, or if you see cyan, it's the soil moisture. And then, of course, all the other color is like a combination of the different things. So what we see here, that if we are in an early stage of the drought, the component that dominates the evolution of the events are the precipitation based. So we see mostly red. Okay, so it means that the anomalies is mostly in short-term SPI, so 1 and 3 months. When we start to move towards the peak of the events, when the event is also a little bit larger, these two are the same events at 2 different times, and this is the same events at 2 different times. So the event is larger, but also the composition of the indicator is different. So we start to see more blue because the SPI1 start to return to normal condition, and we start to see the effect of soil moisture anomaly that start to become,
Okay.
which is what we usually define as a cascading effect. No, first we have a deficit in precipitation, then later on we start to have the effect on the soil moisture, and later on to river discharge, etc. But this usually is done on a time series for a single point. Here we're trying to look at this also from a spatial perspective and see that those things are not the same always, are not the same everywhere. You can see there are a lot of
Of course.
of black. So it
Yep.
means that still the soil moisture, the SPI1 is still relevant in some region, but not in other. So there is also a little bit of differentiation within the event. So we are trying to look at things from this perspective.
So do you add the geology, for example, the amount of clay, for example, because the soil moisture will have a large impact on how this factor is influencing the cascading effect.
Yes, of course. So all this data, and again, as I say, this is like more an inspiration to further explore this kind of topic.
Okay.
Yes, we have all this information, and this soil moisture, for instance, there come from an hydrological model that we run at global scale, which has, of course, within the model all the information on soil texture.
Okay.
But did we analyze, for instance, what is the role of soil texture in causing the delay? No, we didn't actually. It would be nice to do, of course, but yes, there is a lot of that we can do for further on this.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Thank
thank
you
you for your question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carmelo. So yeah, I mean, there were plenty of things here to comment. So now that we are in the open floor discussion, we can try to encourage the participation of all of you. If you have like comments expanding from these ideas or connecting these ideas. For instance, for me it was very interesting to see how from the initiatives that finally are coming from the international organizations, such as the World Meteorological Organization that presented Adriana, because, for example, I remember like many years ago, that one of the big guys in this matter, like Eric Booth, was saying why the World Meteorological Organization is like not having so much initiative, no, on standardizing the different countries' contribution with data to the global perspective of how the status on drought and the status of the hydrology is occurring across the globe. And complementing this with all the new tools that Carmelo was explaining, one of my questions, for example, is in many cases, when we are facing these events that can become even extreme, so with impacts in the population and in the areas, so with risk for the final agents, no, like the population and the farmers, for example, probably the decision makers, as there was one question from Pedro Chambel, are like hesitant, no, a bit on which tool to use, their national tool, or maybe something from the European Commission, like the European Drought Observatory or the Global Drought Observatory, that is like more advanced for some indicators, well, probably for most of the indicators. So there is like a gap, let's say, no, in between the people that is like in the part of development, because maybe we are moving very fast and very triggered, no, but the own exploration and the interest on these amazing things. And then the people that, of course, as they have a lot of responsibility on taking decisions on how to face these risks, how can they incorporate or implement this information into their chains of decision? So that's, for example, one of my questions, no? How can we start to put the people more in common to standardize, no? To collect, to gather all of us, like with the case of the Hydro SOS, from the data that is validated from the national agencies and the regional agencies, or even from regions that are more advanced than this national case, which is the case Akin was explaining, on how all these tools can be like propagated, not like Drought, but from the very advanced tools to the final impact on the users. What do you think about these things?
If I can have a comment on that, I think that having a multi-scale perspective, especially in drought. I mean, as a geologist, probably, since you were mentioning a bit Eric Wood and the background from the geologist, we are much more used to work with floods than droughts. Drought is kind of a little bit more recent development, at least in the geology, let's say, field. We always look at drought more from a climatological perspective. And we are still dealing with a little bit of a drawback from our floods background, where floods are often very, very local scale issue, while with drought, we need a really much more multi-scale perspective. So I will say that so we need to teach, let's say, a little bit of inform the people that have to take decision to keep a little bit the open mind of this multi-scale information, because sometimes it's true that decision needs to be taken locally, and there is a very, very rich set of information available locally that are not available and cannot be retrieved at large scale. But those local scale information needs to be put also in a much broad context, in the context of what's happening in the area surrounding. If a flood occurs in an area, it's interesting only that region, you can handle the problem locally. Impact of drought cascades much more widely in space, and the repercussions are often, so having exactly the same deficit, let me use a terminology of hydrologists, having exactly the same deficit in a river, if it's only that river, but the rest of the world, it's okay, it's one thing. If it's that river under drought, but also is part of a much larger phenomena, it's a completely different way to approach the problem in terms of energy, energy availability, conflict in water, etc. So having this multi-scale approach, I think it's where we should start to have a little bit more integration. So understand that large-scale models are useful, but they are not solving all the problem. Local information are super useful, but they are not giving us the full picture on what is available. So I think that it's a little bit one way probably we have to put the discussion the way to stream the discussion.